Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us at tonight's Facets of Faith panel. My name is Shazia Laddock, and I'm the National Convener for Diversity and Inclusion on the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board. I'm really looking forward to moderating today's discussion on equity and social justice. I hope that it's insightful and educational, while at the same time encourages you to perhaps think a bit differently about this topic, especially in the context of our faith. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that Canada, and indeed all of the land in the Americas, has been the site of human activity for thousands of years. Through ongoing processes of settler colonialism, Indigenous communities have lost and continue to lose their land, heritage, and identities. Because all of you are joining as audience members from different places across Turtle Island, I can't individually acknowledge the land where you may be, but I do want to acknowledge the land on which myself and our three panelists are connecting to this discussion. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. Shalina is joining us from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Munsee Delaware, the Ottawandaran, and the Huron-Wendat. Thalib is joining us from the Coast Salish First Peoples, and Eliza Gulnar is joining us from the Lenape, Shawnee, Wendat, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Kaskaskia, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I encourage all audience members to learn more about whose land you are on. As we continue to have conversations about pluralism, we must stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and their autonomy. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panel. Here with me are three esteemed individuals who are well-versed in the space. Eliza Gulnar Firasta joining us from the US, Thalib Nur Muhammad, and Dr. Shalina Qasim. I'll introduce each panelist briefly and then we'll get started. Eliza Gulnar is currently the Director of Programs for the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland. Gulnar is passionate about promoting empowerment and resiliency in the LGBTQ+ community and marginalized communities through advocacy, outreach, building strong support systems, and ultimately improving quality of life through long-term policy and social change. Thalib is CEO of Jane.com, a large online marketplace for apparel that was named one of INC Magazine's fastest growing companies in 2020. He also shares his experience as an advisor to a number of early and late stage startups in Canada and the US. Thalib is ITHRP Canada's communications convener and is a member of the Council for Canada's Social Justice Working Group. Shalina is a sociologist focusing on critical race and social justice scholarship, and since 2007 has been teaching at the University of Toronto. She currently serves on the Council for Canada's National Diversity and Inclusion Portfolio, both as a co-lead for multi-faith families and as a facilitator for inclusion and equity education sessions. Shalina is also a member of the Council for Canada's Social Justice Working Group. Welcome, panelists. So I'd like to begin today's discussion with a question for all of you. There's no doubt that the world has seen a reckoning with racism after the murder of George Floyd, with individuals and corporations alike outwardly showing their support for the Black Lives Matter movement and organizations and initiatives supporting Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC individuals. But I would argue that the values of social justice, equity, and inclusion have been ingrained in your respective roles for a long time. Tell us about how you've incorporated these into your roles, and we'll start with Dr. Shalina Qasim.
Thanks, Shazia. It's a great question. Certainly for me, I've been advocating for issues of equity and justice and inclusion for decades, and in various roles, both in the community and outside, both professional and voluntary. I've worked in various sectors, including international development, equity, inclusion, human rights. And throughout that work, my focus has been on the issues of justice and equity and on amplifying the voices of those who've historically been marginalized. So often I've worked with African filmmakers, for example, who've brought their perspectives around issues of poverty or gender or culture or identity or the environment. When I worked with the Institute of Ismaili Studies, I was very intentional about the stories and the curriculum that I was participating in writing about around including justice and equity. I've got to say that I've been talking about justice and equity for a long time. In the community, it's sometimes been a very lonely conversation. And I'm very gratified that now, perhaps for one of the first times in my adult life anyway, I'm finding voices that are resonating with my voice around justice and equity. We're having conversations like this. And it's quite amazing that there is a movement that I think is growing and building. In my role as a national member of diversity and inclusion, I certainly try to uphold certain principles of social justice and equity. So, for example, I want us to move away from what I think is an arbitrary division between what happens in the Jamaat and what happens in the world at large. I want us to cultivate a deep understanding that the principles of equity and justice and inclusion are relevant for Ismailis both within and outside the Jamaat. I want to encourage us to be leaders in movements for justice, right? As individuals, I want us to nurture a culture of equity within the Jamaat, where we all understand that equity and justice are central to a pluralistic ethic. We cannot claim to be living a pluralistic ethic if we don't fundamentally incorporate and practice the principles of equity and justice. We need to be providing safer spaces, hopefully like the space that we're providing today, for conversations and education amongst Ismailis about issues of social justice. And I want us to be thinking about the fact that this is not new, that our faith calls for us to be actively engaged in the pursuit of justice and equity. This is not something that's imported from outside the Jamaat. This is fundamentally what we're called upon to do as Muslims. And I know my colleagues will probably speak to that as well. In my own life, I know I have believed that these principles are not something that's separate from the way I am in the world. It is very much central to who I am. It is very much central to how I practice my faith. It is very much central to the guiding ethos of my life. So I'm certainly very gratified that we're having this conversation today.
Thank you, Shalina. We're lucky to have you as part of this discussion. Talib, let's hear from you.
Yeah, listening to Shalina, there's so much that resonates in terms of how we can and we should be finding ways to create spaces for these very important conversations. I think back, in my professional career, one of my roles in government was to run something called the Cross-Cultural Roundtable on Security, which was formed after 9/11 and some of the national security legislation to bring diverse communities into the conversation around national security and what it actually meant to understand from the other side how government responses were being handled and addressed. And since that time, and even before that, during my university days, since that time, I've really reflected on this question of how do we create this environment where people can feel safe and comfortable in expressing who they are, in being accepted for who they are, regardless of race, color, creed, orientation, so on and so forth. And so I think, when we link it to this question of who we are and this, when you ask the question, how do you bring this to your role? I think it's a question of how do we bring this to life in who we are, regardless of the work that we're doing. So for me, whether it is thinking about the work that I do from a Jamaati perspective at ITREB, where it's, asking how do we communicate and engage with the Jamaat, to what I do at work in encouraging my employees to reflect on the importance of social justice and of equity and of diversity in hiring, to the external community work that I do. It really has to be part of who we are. And if Islam at its core we believe to be a way of life, then it is actually impossible for us to separate doing the right thing when it comes to this question from anything else. Our faith calls on us to do good to others, to look at others in a way that is full of love, and to learn about other people, right? There's a wonderful phrase from the Quran that talks about, I have made you of many tribes so that you can know one another. The idea of knowing each other is such an important thing. And so I try to bring that to whatever it is that I do in my interactions, but particularly in those opportunities where I have the blessing of being in a position of some authority to help try and to nurture and cultivate that sense of being. I think it's important for us to bring that to life in the institutional work that we do, because we have this incredible opportunity to bring together members of the Jamaat with such incredible diversities, and to be able to learn and to grow and to be stronger as a community because of that, but also to learn and understand and appreciate the diversities of the people around whom we live. That's a really enriching thing. And I think we have to start seeing those opportunities of engagement as precious, very precious. But I think in that we also have to recognize that there are communities in this country and others that have been historically treated differently because of who they are. And we have a chance and an opportunity to help to even the playing field. And I think we should seize that opportunity as individuals and as a community.
Thank you, Talib, for contextualizing that, as well as calling us to action right away. Eliza, let's hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, especially, from being over the border. I'm really thrilled and filled with gratitude to be here at the opportunity to just have this wonderful, really vital, really important conversation. There's something that both Shalina said and Talib said that resonated with me, and it really has to do with Islam as a way of life. How do you actualize the faith in your day-to-day? And there's, for me, it's so important to have spiritual coherence. And that's a term I got from one of my friends, a fellow Izine. So I'm going to give her full credit. But, often I have found as I was growing up, that there seemed to be some sort of dissonance between, being a practicing person of faith and then what happens in the rest of your life. And as I really sort of sat down and examined that source of discomfort, and I really got to understand my faith and find my place within the community, but also just, reconciling my identity with my faith and where do I fit in, all of those angsty questions that you have as a teenager, right? The thing that really resonated with me every single time, if I was to find one theme, it always came back to this verse of the Quran where Allah says that I've created you from one soul. And so for me, everything sort of radiates out from that. And of course, as a Izine, it's super important for me to find a way to articulate the faith and not make it seem so strange or so, something that we do like in this compartmentalized part of our life, but how do you actually live the faith? And so I kind of found this weird equation that I kind of boiled it down to, which is, who is a Muslim? A Muslim is somebody who submits to the will of God. And so if we are submitting ourselves to the will of the divine, then how do you do that? What does it require? And so, the crux of it really comes down to me as being, a good person, but that, you can simplify it. But if you were to look at it through the lens of nuance and the complexity of what it involves to live your day-to-day lives, social justice and equity and standing up for the oppressed and giving voice to the voiceless is really part and parcel of what it means to submit to the divine. There are countless verses in the Quran that talk about how someone who stands up for the oppressed, or someone who is silenced and doesn't have a voice, somebody who's vulnerable, how that is what is really the true spirit and meaning of Islam and of actually living the faith. And so I have found that as I've gotten older and hopefully wiser, but I don't know if that much wiser, I've really found myself paying attention to the way in which I navigate through the world, through society, through systems, through interactions on a daily basis. And the thing that always stands out to me is, how am I using whatever power or privilege or access I have to create space for somebody who may not have that same access or power or privilege? And what does it mean to really live social justice, to really live through this lens of equity in everything that you do? And last point, I know I'm an Eliza, so we talk a lot, is this idea of intentionality, but also paying attention to impact versus intention, right? Like, we can all have really good intentions about what we're wanting to do or what we're trying to do, but what is the impact? Are we really also paying attention to the way in which we execute things, the way in which we implement things? And so as a program director, I'm always looking at that in my work. Where am I really paying attention to who is being included and who is consequently not being included? And so how do you create that space? How do you create that environment where even the most marginalized are feeling included and feel like they have the safety and the space to have a voice, and also to have input on things that directly impact them?
Thank you, Eliza. I think you brought up many great points, but one that I always come back to is intention versus impact. And I try to think about that anytime I'm having perhaps a difficult conversation, or a conversation that requires me to reframe or stretch myself. So thank you for that reminder. Now I'd like to ask each panelist a question, but of course, other panelists, feel free to jump in if you have some additional thoughts. And so my first question is for Eliza. So one of Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, hadith says, "Paradise lies beneath the feet of the mother." Can you comment on the issue of gender equity across the Jamaat in leadership roles and positions of power?
Sure. The activist in me, or the advocate in me, immediately says, well, like, why would we use that hadith or that saying and reduce the role of a woman down to motherhood, right? Like, it's talking about how paradise lies beneath the feet of a mother. So does that include women who are not mothers? What are we talking about? But then when I step back, I look at myself and I think about, okay, what does it say about me? That my first reaction is to, think of that in terms of that's like the limiting role of women is only through motherhood. We have so many other qualities. We have so many other roles that we play in society. And so that takes me to one of the key things that I think we really need to, as a society and even as a community, do better, is really think about where is that, when we think about faith and the way that faith influences culture and vice versa, how does culture influence faith? And then how does that reflect out into the systems, the society, the social structure, all of the different elements that we sort of live in at the same time? And so I would say that, when we can't just narrow it down to faith and say, oh, it is because of the faith that women's roles are limited, or take like a very limited, narrow view of a saying like this. But we got to expand it out and look past that and say, okay, where did this sort of fixed, fossilized notion of the role of women and what place they have in society. Where did that come from? And if you look back, you will see that a lot of it is cultural. And traditionally, historically, where have we come from, just as people in general? It's, patriarchal, masculine, male-dominated societies. And many of the tafsirs, many of the interpretations of the Quran and of the Hadith and all of that, they're from a man's point of view. So why have we not included other diverse points of view, right? And especially as people who are, wanting to really embrace pluralism, as wanting to really live into this notion of pluralism, then why is there not a plurality of perspectives and interpretations of the faith and of the sayings of the prophet, et cetera, and other, theological documents? Why is that not also incorporated? And so I think that, in terms of the second part of your question about gender equity in our institutional structures, again, I think that we have formed structures and systems that reflect the society around us, because that is what we're exposed to, that's what we're familiar with. I would also say that we should go back to where we come from, in terms of coming from countries and places that were colonialized. So what is the impact of this colonialism on the way in which we think about what is normal for a community in terms of the way that it's structured, what it values, how equity plays out. And so I think that, for good or bad, in many ways, when we tried to assimilate into the dominant cultural narrative, which was, patriarchal and coming from a colonial point of view, our systems evolved to reflect that. I'm not saying that is wrong or bad at all. And I want to be very clear about that. It was just what we knew. And when you don't know what you don't know. On the other hand, if you go back to places like India before colonialism, and I'm not saying things were perfect or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination, but I look at like the mythology and I look at the gods and goddesses, and the goddesses were very powerful. The goddesses had this inherent strength and vibrancy and bravery, and they occupied these really important places, even hierarchically, right? And so I question, well, what happened to that? And one of the first things that pops into my mind is the colonialism, which kind of shifted this whole like cultural narrative in which we lived. So I think that, we got to be more nuanced in our view of, well, yes, we lack gender equity, but we also lack equity in terms of where we're from, in terms of orientation, in terms of race, in terms of economic status. When we look at the way our hierarchies are set up, and try to remind ourselves that, we don't want to continue to propagate this stratification within our community, but we want to move towards, how do we eliminate that so it doesn't become fossilized?
Yeah, exactly. And Talib, I would love to hear your perspective on a similar question. So approaching this from the ITHRIB lens, how do we communicate and, act upon our role as Ismailis when we're having discussions of equity, inclusion, and social justice?
It's a great question, and it's been a topic of a lot of conversations over the course of the last little while. And we think about who we are, context becomes really important. And so our opportunity really is to make sure that as young people are thinking about how to become advocates for social justice, how to become engaged in understanding difference, and not just young people, all of us understanding difference and being active participants in building that equity that we want to build in our community. Our opportunity as institutions is really to focus on how do we situate this within the context of Islam, as Gulnar and Shalina have done tonight, and to really give ourselves the opportunity of understanding our own respective contexts in our communities, in the country, and how to navigate those opportunities to be actively engaged in our own frame and our own understanding with our own faith tradition and our understanding of that calling from within Islam. And I think that's a really powerful way to enter into conversations about social justice, about equity, about diversity, by knowing that it comes from who we are. And so to be able to situate our participation in those conversations in a way that is truly one that we can bring something that is ours, and that is really part of who we are. I think we are hopefully predisposed, or should be predisposed, to understanding the importance of pluralism. If we look at our own histories, we come from different parts of the world, having had different experiences, whether it's in Central Asia or Syria, or living in East Africa, or living in the Indian subcontinent, so on and so forth. So we have a variegated set of experiences that in recent history and longer history that we've had. I think where it becomes important for us as a Jamaat, as Ismailis, as individuals, is to really recognize that as a faith community, as people who belong to a faith community, we have sort of this dual kind of opportunity. One, to draw on lessons from the faith and real guidance from the faith itself, the speeches of the Imam, the Quran. There is a long history in who we are that talks about the importance of diversity, of including others, of thinking about those who may have more, who may have less, who may be different in a variety of different ways. And then I think there's also this opportunity that we have as a community, not a faith necessarily, as a faith community, but as a community, to ask ourselves, how can we actually be meaningful agents and advocates for living this pluralism and embracing the notion of social justice in everything that we do? So when we think about our programs, I think we have really made a lot of, I think over the course of the last number of years, a lot of changes in terms of how we reflect on, for example, land acknowledgements, thinking about who we include, making sure that we do as much as possible bring forward a diversity of viewpoints. Certainly, there's lots to do. I think there's lots of opportunity for us to continue to learn and to grow. But I think as a community, the fact that we are having these discussions, I think, sets it up nicely for us to really ask what we've done well and to learn from those things. And where we have room to improve, to really look at best practice from other communities, from community organizations, from other faith communities, from other cultural communities, from the private sector, to say, how can we bring some of that best practice to this type of work? Because as you said earlier, Shalina, this is not just about social justice and diversity inclusion that lives in a black box on its own. This is and should be part of how we reflect on all of the institutional work that we do, but all of the work that we do as individuals. We have to be asking ourselves, by doing this in the way that I am I making this difficult for somebody else? Am I forgetting a point of view that we should be hearing and we should be reflecting on? And I think one of the advantages that we have in having these conversations is that by starting to ask those questions in a way that makes us curious and makes us willing participants on the journey, I think we can bring a lot of people along with us. And I think this is such an important part of the work that I think we're all trying to do. And that is to say, look, none of us have this right. And that's okay, so long as we're willing to try and work together to do that. So this really should be an inclusive exercise. If we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's really important for us to try and build a journey where everyone feels that they can learn from this, that they can grow from this opportunity, and that we can, at the end of the day, find ourselves as better partners and as a more, I think, open community and a more inclusive community in our own mindset. And as individuals, that we are much more capable and excited about the opportunity of engaging with difference in a way that is truly productive and that makes us richer through it.
Thanks, Salib. You mentioned a few things that kind of stuck out to me. One was being agents of change. Another one was being willing participants. And I've noticed, as you know, myself, others have begun to have more and more of these discussions. Many of them do center around Blackness and whiteness, or Blackness versus whiteness. So next question is for you, Shalina, with that in mind. But given that in our community, there's neither a large Black nor white population, help us with how critical race theory and principles might apply to the Ismaili community.
Thanks, Shazia. Great question. Before I do that, though, is it possible for me to jump in on the gender equality question? You knew I was going to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go for it.
I completely agree with Alvaiza Gulnar here that we need to look at gender equity, gender equality in a broader, larger context. We don't have gender equality, not just in our community. We don't have gender equity in society because what they have in common here is we live within patriarchies. And that could be patriarchal systems of economics, it could be patriarchal systems of culture, it could be patriarchal systems of interpretations of faith. And Alvaiza Gulnar did a great job of pointing us in some of that direction. I think it's a really important question to ask, therefore, why are women not always in positions of leadership or power? That's a really important question, and we need to sort of unpack that a little bit. But I think it's also important to look at why these particular positions are considered leadership and meritorious in the first place, right? What are we valuing? What are we not valuing? So if we look at the gender division of labor, in most contexts, not just our own again, in most contexts, traditionally, men have worked outside the home and women and made money, and women have traditionally worked inside the home and not been compensated financially, right? So it's important for us, and I'm going to say for me as a feminist even, to ask why women and why their labor and their work are not as strongly valued, outside the home, but also important to ask why women's labor in the traditional sense is not valued or even seen as quote unquote real labor, right? Why is it that we see a stay-at-home woman, and you note that I don't say stay-at-home mother, I say stay-at-home woman, is considered unemployed or someone who doesn't work? Why do we value certain types of leadership positions more than the folks who clean the Jamaat Khanas or who cook us meals on Khushali Day? Frankly, on Khushali Day, those people are probably even more important to us than anybody else, right? So it's important, I think, for us to take a deeper look at what we value, what sorts of experiences we value, what sorts of work and labor we value, and why. So what are the fundamental discourses that sort of underlie these sorts of ideas? And this relates to who is seen to have, quote unquote, and I use the word in quotation marks very consciously, who is considered to have merit for leadership positions? What are the experiences, what are the attributes that we value when we consider merit? Are those that are, do we consider certain types of experiences and attributes more valuable and more meritorious, if you want, for leadership positions? Now, that's not to say that women aren't appointed for leadership positions, and I want to acknowledge that we certainly in Canada have made a lot of progress in this respect. I don't for a minute want to say that we have not made progress. We absolutely have made progress. So, it's important to acknowledge that, but it's also important to ask ourselves what's going on beyond that, right? So whilst it's important for young women to see that they can lead in the community, I think it's also important for them to see that the entire range of labor and work are important and has meaning, whatever their choices, right? So artists, working class women, those who contribute service in so many other ways, they're all important to keeping the Jamaat functioning and making progress, right? So essentially, I want to posit that our idea of merit is always culturally conditioned, how it's defined, who defines it, in what time, in what space. All these shape how we see ideas of leadership, ideas of merit, and how we include or not the voices, work, and leadership of women. And I want us to urge us also to think of merit in the broadest, widest, deepest sense. We know that the most diverse teams and communities are the most resilient and usually the most successful. So can we, I want to ask us to broaden our understanding of what merit means, what leadership means. Incidentally, of course, this idea of merit not only includes certain types of women, it also includes, or certain types of women who have skills that are not traditionally viewed as meritorious. And I'm not for a minute saying they're not meritorious, I'm just pointing out what our thinking is around them. It also excludes working class women, and in the Canadian context, sometimes it excludes those who are not South Asian, who don't emerge from South Asian contexts, who are not often seen to have the same attributes and experiences. So I kind of wanted to round out that conversation about gender equality, if I may. So your question about critical race theory, great question, Shazia. In a society that so much is centered around race, I think critical race theory applies to everyone. We tend to talk about racism as if it were in the past. I would argue it's definitely not in the past. It's very definitely present in the contemporary world. Only a year ago, it seems like a long time ago, only a year ago did we have, railway blockades. Nooses have been found on construction sites in Toronto repeatedly, even through this year. 1,200 Indigenous women and girls went missing, and police didn't notice until much later. So a lot of issues in which race is deeply embedded. This year, the Black Lives Movement has been protesting the death of Black bodies, but they've been protesting this for years. And this year, the issue took center stage when we all watched, really, really horrified, as George Floyd, a Black man, and of course so many others, were literally killed on television. So I think we need to understand these issues and how they illuminate societal injustice. So what does critical race theory do for us? I think it does a number of things for us, really important things. First of all, it shows us that race is not just about a biological attribute. It's about how race and skin color come to mean certain political things in the society in which we live, right? So if you look at the way in which we've developed, we could have chosen that people who wear glasses, there's 3 of us wearing glasses, that we have power, and those who don't wear glasses don't have power. It sounds ridiculous when I put it that way, and yet this is precisely what we've done. We've taken political projects of colonialism. There you go, Talib, thank you for that. We've taken political projects of colonialism and capitalism or slavery and made race mean certain things. So critical race theory allows us to see that race is not just about skin color, but it's about how skin color has been used to differentiate people, has been used to differentiate resources and access to power and privilege. Critical race theory allows us to apply a historical lens. It helps us to see society that's not just in the immediate and not just in the now, but it situates the contemporary situation in how historically we've come together in this way, right? Critical race theory allows us to apply an intersectional lens so we can nuance and complicate our discussions about race and other forms of oppression. A Black woman will have specific experiences that operate along racial and gender lines, and similarly, LGBTQ individuals will operate with those lines as well. I think perhaps most importantly, critical race theory allows us to look at issues of race and oppression not as matters of individual prejudice, but as systemic issues. They allow us to understand that these issues are not about prejudice and attitudes held by individuals, although those, of course, are shaped by our ideas about race, but it's about how systems operate. Racism is produced, reproduced daily by the laws, by the rules, by practices, by norms. This is what I call it's built into society's DNA. So for example, if you look at the colonization of North America, indigenous communities were living here, settlers came, they took over the land, and then they used law, they created laws to justify the takeover of land, and they embedded racial codifications at the heart of it. I have plenty of examples, but we perhaps, if we have a discussion, I'm happy to talk about them. So critical race theory helps us to decenter these ideas, to take them apart, to unpack them, to look at them. What does this all have to do with the Ismaili community? As Shazia, you said, maybe does it have anything to do with the way we function? I would argue absolutely it has something to do with us. Because while critical race theory is not just about Blackness or whiteness, it is about how race is deployed in the interests of white power and privilege. We don't live in a colorblind world, right? So as much as we'd like to believe, we do. So if we look at our community, traditionally, we have the communities which have formed the Ismaili community have all experienced some form of colonization or white supremacy. So in South Asia, there was British colonization and partition. Some of the Jamaat there moved to Eastern Africa, and they lived in extremely racist colonial environments. Afghanistan has been invaded repeatedly, right? Iran has seen repeated interventions, including the orchestration of a coup. Syria and Arab countries have experienced bombing campaigns, invasions, sanctions, all of them justified by sort of Islamophobic rhetoric. So these experiences are different in specifics, but what they have in common is an experience with racism and white supremacy. Now, as we live in Canada, understandably, we are relatively new immigrants, depending on which wave you came in. We often try to fit in, and we try not to destabilize our community's position and security. Perfectly understandable. I understand. I'm from an immigrant family as well. But we need to be aware that as individuals, one of the consequences of that is that we sometimes want to be neutral, and perhaps we want to aspire to whiteness, right? So that what it does is it inadvertently justifies racism, or excuses racism, not justifies, excuses racism and racist practices because we don't want to be engaged. Conversations like this help to bring us back to those realities, right? And this is often where we stand. We stand sort of in this, what I call this moderate place, right? Martin Luther King has said that sometimes, in his opinion, the greatest stumbling block for Black folks was not necessarily the KKK individual, but what he calls a white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, right? And sometimes we would rather not tip the boat. And again, understandable. But what often happens is that we then become complicit in those systems of oppression. We choose justice for some and not for others. And justice is indivisible. And if we need, and Alwais Gulnar talked about using our power and our privilege to speak up and to engage with issues, to amplify voices that have been historically marginalized. That's really, really important. We need to build those solidarities, because if we don't, what might happen, and that's what one of my fears is, that we internalize these ideas and we internalize the oppression. So it can be very damaging, because we sort of push away our own identities, and we take on the ideas that whiteness is superior and darkness is not. So even comments like your daughter is very beautiful, even though she's dark, right? Those comments speak very powerfully. And I don't want to condemn anybody for saying that, because this is not an individual problem. We have internalized some of these ideas and some of these norms. And these internalized ideas may impact our interaction with others within the Jamaat. We may be uncomfortable with those who've just arrived and feel or assume that they need to assimilate faster to Canadian society. That means, 50 years, and I'm from a South Asian family, 50 years after we've arrived in Canada, are we replicating some of those ideas, some of those forms of understanding that we experience? So for me, critical race theory is central to understanding our place, our identities, and to engage in these conversations of social justice.
Thank you, Shalina. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in. There were, I was taking notes as you were talking, because there were all these things that were coming to the forefront of my mind as you were speaking, and many of them resonate. But one of the things that you were talking about is, how do we value different types of leadership, right? And that makes me think about capitalism, right? Because we live in a capitalistic society, a capitalistic world, we have gotten used to really assessing or valuing not just other people's worth, but our own worth in very much monetary terms or material terms, that, the value of someone or what they do is based on their successes and their accomplishments. And then those accomplishments and successes are really assessed in terms of, how does this help you climb up the social ladder? How does this help you acquire things? How does this help you financially, right? And so the more successful you are, it really sort of equates into the richer you are. And so, we got to go back and think about, as people of faith, as we consider ourselves, wanting to live our faith, that how do we get back, rebalance this notion to society? How do you measure that? Isn't it just as valuable, or not, or even more so, that there's, you go help your neighbor who is an elderly, frail person in this time of COVID, for example, to make sure that they're not starving because they can't get to the grocery store. So you're helping them. You're saving a human life. And if you go back to the Quran, what does the Quran say? To save one life is as if to save all of humanity. So I think, we got to reflect and think about where did this change happen, where we kind of start valuing people in these solely materialistic terms, in terms of goods, right? Or output or production, or, and a lot of it has to do with capitalism. And I'm not saying that I'm against capitalism. I think that there is some level of capitalism required for all of us to be able to put food on the table and pay the rent. But I think that, where we are right now is there's this huge historical imbalance of capitalism without any purpose. And when I think about what the Imam has been talking about over the last 15, 20 years, he's been talking about not just ethics and living an ethical life, or living a life in congruence with the Islamic value system, but more recently, the Imam has been talking about what is the value of education? What is the value of pursuing financial success? It's good that you have enough to take care of your family, but you don't need excess wealth. And when we look back historically in our community, this idea of Beit al-Mal, the communal wealth, that is what our wealth should be going to, right? So you have what you need to live your daily life, to take care of your family, but who really needs millions of dollars sitting in the bank? Right? What are you doing with that excess wealth? And so I just wanted to touch on that point. And I think Talib was trying to say something. Sorry.
No, I just, just reflecting on what you're saying, Gulnar, there's such an interesting, kind of, I think, I use the word opportunity. I think it is an opportunity. I was reflecting on a speech that Maulana Hazrat gave at the Asia Society in the 70s. And he was talking in this context about the built environment. In that speech, Maulana Hazrat talks about how man and nature are one, spirit and body are one. But then he goes on to say, man is responsible to God for what man has created. And you take that line and you think about that in terms of the types of societies and the types of communities that we create. We actually have a responsibility to God to think about what type of world we are building, not just the physical world, but how we think about our interactions with other people, how we think about how we show up to things. And this whole notion of, that which is in excess, share and be generous with it. It's not just about money. It's about time. It's about intellectual skill. It's about labor. It's about all of these different things. That which is in excess, give it to others to help, right? And I think this idea of trying to level the playing field should not be seen as, because I am giving to someone who is lesser, but I have the blessing and the opportunity to share what I have with somebody else. And that is a gift that is being given to me, not just the other way. And I think if we start to see difference and we start to see people that have a different perspective or a different tradition or a different color of skin, or speak a different language, as people from whom we have the blessing of engaging, I think it changes the mindset. And I think if we can start to root this in the faith that we connect with, the faith community that we feel we want to be connected to and that we are a part of, I think it really calls on us to ask ourselves quietly, privately, am I doing my best at actually living these values that I talk about? And this idea of living our values, I think if we look at the time in which we find ourselves now because of COVID, has become ever more important. How we think about checking up on people that are vulnerable, how we think about realizing the inequity that COVID has actually shown between people that have the capacity and the wealth to be able to do Zoom meetings and work from home versus people who have to go to the front line at the grocery store or clean hospitals, who may not have the privilege of working from home. And to just start to unpack that in our day-to-day lives. Look at the people who are heroes today. They're the frontline workers. They're the same people that we may have been frustrated by because they didn't bag our groceries the way that we wanted them to a year and a half ago. All of a sudden, we have started to think about worth and work very, very differently. And so I think there's actually a really wonderful opportunity for us, as we have been sort of blessed with this opportunity that COVID actually provides us, to be much more reflective about how society is structured, to also think about in our own Jamati context, what is it meant? What is it meant to us? And how can we learn from this? I mean, the fact that we have been looking at doing programming online is a big step for us. Why? Because we recognize that there is an opportunity and a need. And the crisis around COVID has allowed us to do things like this. But I think it's also opened our minds and our hearts to realizing that if we want to be truly successful, Gulnar, in the way that you described it, in the sense of being a truly connected, pluralistic community that actually lives what it believes, then I think this is an opportunity for us to take on a very, very different sort of challenge. And we are really, really good when a challenge comes our way, whether it's, setting up a kushali in 3 days, or whether it's rallying to sew masks, as so many of our seniors have done. We really rally around a challenge, I think, as a community. And I think it's a chance for us to rally around the challenge of rethinking fundamentally how we actually think about this role that our faith has always talked about. And sometimes we've put that to the back burner. But now it's given, I think, this ethos of the fact that we have come from one soul, that we actually are called upon to know difference as a blessing in a very different way. And so I think I'm hopeful. I think I'm hopeful because this conversation and others like it are going to cause, I believe, us to think about problems differently and to really see these challenges as an opportunity to come together in ways that we perhaps wouldn't have been comfortable doing before.
I'm hopeful too. And we've heard some great ideas from all three of you now. We've heard from Shalina about amplifying and raising up voices, right? We've heard from Eliza about really living pluralism. And we've now heard from you, Thalib, about really the Muslim responsibility that we have. And so that's kind of how I want to end the panel is what next, what now, right? We've heard from Maulana Hazar Imam in October 2010 at the La Fontaine Baldwin Symposium. He said, "A pluralistic environment is a kaleidoscope that history shakes every day. Responding to pluralism is an exercise in constant readaptation. Identities are not fixed in stone. What we imagine our communities to be must also evolve with the tides of history." So kind of using that as context, I'd like to ask all of you one final question, and that is, what is the role and responsibility of Ismailis, both within and outside the Jamaat, in promoting social justice, equity, inclusion, and belonging, not just now, but on an ongoing basis? And it's anyone's game to start, so go ahead.
I'll jump right in because, clearly Wazine love to talk. I would say that, the role of Ismailis, and I want to, and I tie this back to something that you said, Thalib, that is really, really critical, which is looking at these opportunities as a blessing. But I would try to reframe that and say, think about it as, okay, I'm grateful for this opportunity to submit to the will of God, because now I am able to really, truly live Islam, which is a way of life. How wonderful, how great is that to be able to find spiritual coherence, not just in my spiritual life, but also in the way that I live this physical, earthly, material life. There's one, if I may, I would like to share a quote that I often go back to and I really think about every day, which is from the Najl Balagha, the sayings of Imam Ali, the letters and sermons of Imam Ali. And he says that, You must always appreciate and adopt a policy which is based upon equity and justice. Remember, the displeasure and disapproval of common men, have-nots, and depressed persons more than overbalances the approval of important persons. The common men, the poor, are the pillars of Islam. They are the real assemblage. Keep an open mind for them. And so, to me, right there is like the call to social justice, right? Thinking about every day in everything that we do about, this is my intent, but what is the impact going to be? When you say like we're doing all this virtual programming, my first thought was, well, who's being left out? How are we getting to the folks that may not have the privilege of access to the internet or to technology? I live in Cleveland, one of the most digitally segregated cities in the United States. It's something that I have to think about and navigate and try to work around every day, even in this time of COVID when we can't be together. How are we still reaching those that are most vulnerable, that are the most marginalized? And that goes back to something that Shalina talked about, which is centering, right? And I want to offer another idea, which is decentering, because all of these thoughts and ideas about thinking about the marginalized and who is not being served, they require us to decenter the majority, those that have privilege, those that have access, those that have power, and really center those who are voiceless, who are vulnerable, who are marginalized. You look at the Quran, how many times does the Quran talk about the rights of orphans? At that time, if you think about it culturally and contextually, they were the most disposable of the disposable in society. Nobody cared about them. Nobody cared about women. So when we look at world religions historically, they have always been interpreted from a male perspective, because predominantly, historically, we've always lived in a patriarchal society. And I think there's a case to be made for including other diverse perspectives around the different religions, and that, including a woman's point of view, which I think is really important. And I wonder what type of clarity or inspiration that might add to for us to draw on. So, I think it's really critical and important for us to remember that here we are in a faith that placed value and reminded people of the inherent value of human life, of dignity, of all people, even those that were considered as disposable, like women and daughters and orphans. Right. And so I think that if we are able to remember to decenter ourselves as people of privilege within our community, then we have a great hope for progress, because as a community, we are only as good as the weakest amongst us. Right. So we have to strengthen each of those bonds, each of those chains. And so I think that, those are my thoughts around how do we move forward and where do we go moving forward.
Thank you, Eliza. Talib, thoughts on what more we can do?
I was going to ask you to ask Shalina to go next because I am trying
Okay.
I think it's absolutely right. For me, decentering is critical to what we do. I think it's really, really important that we continue these conversations. It is notable that it is ITREB that is hosting this conversation today. And I want to make a special note of that because I think social justice is not new to Muslims. It is not exclusive to Muslims, but it is certainly not new. And it is not new to Ismailis. This is part of our history. The Quran talks about the human being as the Khalifa, the deputy, the steward of society, right? So in our responsibility to God, there is something about creating a more equitable, a more just world. The preamble of the Ismaili Constitution tells us to make a valid and meaningful contribution to the improvement of the quality of life of the Ummah and the societies in which we live. This is centrally located in our identities as Ismaili Muslims. And so I completely agree that as we move forward, I would like to see more of these conversations. I would like movements of young Ismailis and older Ismailis, perhaps not so young as people like me, to actually be engaged in these conversations together in movements for solidarity, so that both within and outside the Jamaat, we are actively contributing to making our community, our society, a more equitable, a more just space for all of us live, a space where we all feel that we belong. The Imam, in one of his speeches, talks in the same speech actually that Shazia talked about earlier. He used a beautiful metaphor of a musical of music to talk about pluralism. He said we often think of social harmony when we think of diversity, but he talked about counterpoint. He talked about where voice and instruments play off against each other, each being independent and yet forming a united whole. What better metaphor for our Jamaat, and what better metaphor for our society, where we can all bring all our diversity, Talib spoke about, bring all of who we are and be welcomed and feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, living together. And so being independent and yet being part of a larger whole. Right? So I think as we move forward, I would certainly like to see these conversations continuing and the movement continuing forward.
Thank you, Shalina. Talib, over to you.
Just reflecting a little bit on the comments, the very rich comments that Shalina and Gulnar have shared, I come back to this question, Shazia, that you asked about, as Ismailis, where now and where to from here? And I start with this question of how do we refer to ourselves? You know, we always say we are brothers and sisters. And that, to me, is at its core a remarkably equalizing thing. Because if we are all at that same level, then I think we need to start thinking about ourselves in those terms. And if we who have privilege and who have been blessed with the things that we have start to understand that, and this point that Gulnar made about decentering ourselves from the conversation and perhaps moving to center to those who have never necessarily been that center, it causes us to really think carefully about how do we equalize things in a way that allows people to be fully participant in the community. Like, this community that we have is a very, very special thing. We rally around each other. But I think, you know, where there is even more opportunity is to say, if we actually find ways to intentionally continue these conversations, to bring those voices into the conversation that haven't been heard before, and to action that hasn't been taken before, what it allows us to do is to bring so much more wealth of a different kind to the much larger conversation that we have as a community, and who we are and who we can show up as, and then what contributions we can make to a broader society. You know, as I think about where to next, then I think the real question becomes, how well do we do as institutions, not in saying we must do this or we must do that, but rather how do we start to think about education? How do we think about creating space for conversation, for diverse viewpoints to be heard? And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to start to say, this conversation and others like it are really the beginning of a lot of great work that needs to be done, but that is so well grounded in faith. But our ability to be able to say, let's engage in understanding the experience of indigenous communities, of members of the Jamaat who have come from a part of the world that is unfamiliar to us, of people with backgrounds that we may not have understood, and acknowledge that there is so much for us to learn together. If we start with this premise that we all have something to learn from each other, I think it becomes much easier for us then to continue to build and build and build to the point where we may never be able to fully understand how somebody else's life has gone or what their history is, but we'll be able to, I think, be much more appreciative of it, compassionate towards it, and grateful for having learned that. And I think the where to from here really is now to say to everyone that is watching this, you know, whether it's tonight or in the weeks ahead when it's available on the website, to really say, what can we do as individuals to take this on in whatever way that we can, to ask ourselves the question that we've all been sort of talking about today. If this really is part of who I am and what I'm supposed to be as an Ismaili Muslim, Am I doing my part? And it doesn't need to be a public declaration of what you're doing, but to ask yourself, what can I be doing on a day-to-day basis to just change, reframe, rethink, adjust, and look a little bit differently at the world in which I find myself, and to acknowledge, what I have that others may not, and to look a little bit deeper at what we can do as individuals living this ethos of pluralism.
Can I just add one thing to that is, these conversations, this journey is uncomfortable. And I just want to acknowledge that it can be discomforting and it can be uncomfortable, but that is okay. That is completely okay. We have to get comfortable with sitting in the discomfort, because it's when we sit in it and we truly think about it and reflect on it and mull over it, that's when we are able to really think about it intellectually and spiritually and find some clarity through the grace of God. And so I just wanted to say, if you're having feelings of discomfort, you're having feelings of feeling uncomfortable, that's perfectly normal. And I encourage that. I would encourage that instead, though, don't shut the door on it in a hurry to try to feel back to homeostasis. Instead, embrace the discomfort so that you can have change and we can move forward. So I just wanted to add that little piece in there. And, and maybe you can find hope in this, or inspiration and strength is, the Imam constantly telling us even 3 seconds of remembering the names of Allah, Ali, Muhammad, or just thinking about God, any 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 30 seconds spent in remembrance of your faith. What is he really trying to remind us? Like, be conscious of God's presence and for me, I found that it automatically makes me think about what I'm doing, what is the impact of my work, how am I living my faith? And I think ultimately that, in my view, that's the Imam telling us, like, yes, 30 seconds, I'm going to make it really easy for you. But hey, that's 30 seconds of you checking in to say, hey, am I living my life in spiritual coherence? Or am I compartmentalizing it where I'm like Ismaili and Jamaat kind of and doing all the things, and then outside of that, it's a different story, or we forget, or we get so involved. And I think that, for me, this has been a really great tool to lean on is, when I have that moment, it automatically now reminds me to think about, what am I doing in terms of being a good servant of God? How am I submitting to God, and how am I living that out?
I think that's a beautiful way to end. I'm so grateful for the time and thoughts from all three of you. So thank you, Shalina, thank you, Alwiza, and thank you, Talib, for engaging with me in this discussion. Thank you to those of you who are here and are watching this Facets of Faith panel. Our hope is that this is the beginning of many future conversations about the role we play in a more just and equitable society for all. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone about the access line that allows you to access resources, information, or assistance of any type. The number is 1-888-536-3599. You can also visit iicanada.org for further information on how to contact the access line. Thank you again for joining us.